Hey guys, when people imagine life in the Middle Ages, they often picture castles, candlelight, stone churches, and quiet villages under a dark sky. But one of the strangest parts of medieval life was not always the danger, the cold, or even the work. It was the almost constant presence of other people. Privacy, in the modern sense, was not simply rare. For many people, it was barely imaginable. Before we step into that crowded world, tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like to hear next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a like is a simple way to support it. And if you want more calm, quietly fascinating history videos, you're very welcome to subscribe. So tonight, let's walk slowly into the medieval household, the village street, the castle chamber, the monastery dormitory, and the crowded inn, and see why living without real privacy was not just uncomfortable, but deeply revealing of how medieval society worked. To understand medieval privacy, we have to begin with a small but important adjustment. Medieval people were not simply careless about privacy because they were less refined than people today. That would be too easy, and it would also be unfair. They lived in a world where buildings were expensive, fuel was limited, space was shared, labor was constant, and survival depended on closeness. The household was not only a private home. It was also a workplace, a sleeping space, a storage space, a social unit, and sometimes a small economic machine. People cooked, worked, ate, argued, repaired tools, nursed the sick, trained children, sheltered animals, received neighbors, and hosted travelers inside spaces that modern people might consider impossibly small. In many medieval homes, especially among peasants and ordinary townspeople, there was no neat division between public and private life. A single room could carry the weight of almost an entire household. During the day, it might be a place for preparing food, spinning thread, mending clothing, sharpening tools, brewing ale, feeding children, and speaking with visitors. At night, the same room might become a sleeping area, with family members lying close together on straw mattresses, benches, pallets, or shared bedding. The hearth, if the household had one, was not just a source of warmth. It was the center of the room, and therefore the center of social life. Around it, bodies gathered because heat was precious. This is one of the first quiet surprises of the medieval world. Privacy was not always absent because people did not want it. It was absent because warmth, light, and shelter pulled people together. If one room held the fire, then one room held the family. If one candle was costly, then several people worked by the same flame. If winter pressed against the walls, closeness was not merely social. It was practical. The discomfort of being watched, overheard, or jostled had to be measured against the deeper discomfort of cold, hunger, and insecurity. Even the shape of medieval buildings worked against seclusion. Many ordinary homes were built around open, multipurpose interiors. Internal rooms existed, of course, especially in larger houses, manor homes, monasteries, and urban dwellings of wealthier families, but the kind of private bedroom that feels ordinary today was far from universal. A bed itself could be a valuable object, sometimes shared by more than one person, and in poorer homes it was not necessarily a personal possession. To have a separate bed, let alone a separate chamber, was a mark of status. To close a door and be alone behind it was, for many people, closer to a luxury than a daily expectation. And even when doors existed, they did not always mean what modern doors mean. A door could protect goods, keep out animals, reduce drafts, or mark authority, but it did not necessarily promise solitude. People moved through rooms because homes were arranged by function, not by individual emotional boundaries. A servant might pass through a sleeping area to reach storage. Children might sleep near adults. Apprentices might share space with masters. Lodgers might occupy corners of the same building. In a workshop, The master's household and business could overlap so completely that privacy became almost impossible to separate from work. This was especially true in medieval towns. Town life could be lively, profitable, and full of opportunity, but it also meant density. Streets were narrow, houses leaned close, workshops opened toward the street. Markets brought constant movement. Neighbors heard quarrels, smelled cooking, noticed visitors, watched deliveries, and remembered who came and went. The urban household was often porous, not sealed away from the outside world. Windows might not have glass in the modern sense, especially for ordinary people. Shutters, cloth, oiled parchment, or wooden screens could help, but they did not create silence. Sound traveled easily through timber, wattle, plaster, and close-built walls. A medieval town was not only a place where people lived near one another. It was a place where reputation lived near them too. What others saw and heard mattered. A person's honor, credit, trustworthiness, and marriage prospects could be shaped by community knowledge. Privacy in this setting was not simply about personal comfort. It was tied to social survival. Being observed could be irritating, but it also had a protective function. Neighbors noticed theft. They witnessed agreements. They gave testimony. They watched behavior. They helped enforce moral expectations. They also gossiped, judged, misunderstood, and interfered. This is where the medieval lack of privacy. To modern ears, constant observation sounds oppressive, and often it could be. But in a world with fewer formal systems of identification, policing, insurance, and personal documentation, being known by others was also a kind of security. A stranger without witnesses was vulnerable. A deal without witnesses could be disputed. A woman without community support could be exposed to suspicion. A craftsman without a public reputation could struggle to trade. The village and the street could feel intrusive, but they were also the network through which people were recognized. In the countryside, the pattern was different but no less intimate. A medieval village was not a collection of private lives hidden behind garden walls. It was a community of shared fields, common duties, seasonal rhythms, and mutual dependence. People worked side by side. They saw one another at the well, at the mill, at church, in the fields, on feast days, during harvest, and during moments of crisis. The open field system, where strips of land were cultivated by different households within larger shared fields, meant that work itself was visible. Your labor, your delays, your animals, your tools, your debts, your attendance at obligations, all of it could become known. The village did not need modern surveillance because the structure of life made secrecy difficult. A person who failed to appear for work could be noticed. A household short of food might be guessed by its purchases, its borrowing, or its thin livestock. A conflict between neighbors could spill into common knowledge quickly because there were so few places where conflict could remain hidden. Even the church played a role in making life public. Attendance, rituals, marriages, baptisms, funerals, confessions, penance, and public moral expectations all shaped the community's awareness of individual behavior. Yet we should be careful not to imagine medieval people as living in one continuous crowd without any desire for interior life. They had secrets, shame, longing, grief, private prayers, hidden fears, and personal ambitions. They knew the difference between public and intimate matters. They had words and customs for secrecy, discretion, honor, modesty, and shame. What they lacked was not the emotional capacity for privacy. What they lacked was the material and architectural world that makes modern privacy feel normal. That difference matters. A modern person often thinks of privacy as a basic condition. A room, a phone, a locked door, a personal bed, personal clothing, personal paperwork, personal time. But in medieval Europe, privacy was more often negotiated than guaranteed. It appeared in fragments. A corner near the hearth, a moment outside before dawn, a quiet walk to a field boundary, a whispered exchange behind a screen, a prayer murmured in church, a curtain around a bed in a wealthier home, a chest where precious items were locked away. Privacy existed, but it was patchy, practical, and unevenly distributed. The rich had more of it, though even they did not always have it in the modern sense. In castles and great houses, there were chambers, halls, chapels, wardrobes, service rooms, and sometimes more specialized private spaces. A lord or lady might withdraw from the great hall into a chamber, and the very act of withdrawal signaled rank. To be able to move away from the crowd was power. But aristocratic life was also full of attendants. Servants dressed their masters, carried water, made beds, prepared fires, delivered messages, guarded doors, and waited nearby. A noble person might possess a private chamber, but not necessarily a private life. In fact, high status could make a person more visible, not less. Important people were watched because access to them mattered. Their meals, movements, visitors, alliances, gestures, and moods could have political meaning. A lord's household was not a small family unit. It could be a large institution, full of retainers, clerks, servants, guests, dependents, and petitioners. The Great Hall was designed for display, hospitality, hierarchy, and supervision. Eating was not merely nourishment. It was performance. Seating arrangements showed rank. The distance from the Lord's table could say something about power. Even generosity was public. This creates one of the most interesting reversals in the story. The poor often lacked privacy because they lacked space. The powerful often lacked privacy because they had too much attention. Their bodies, clothing, ceremonies, marriages, heirs, guests, and household order were part of their public identity. A peasant might dream of a separate chamber because it meant comfort. A noble might dream of solitude because almost every gesture could be interpreted. The bedchamber is a useful place to pause, because it shows how differently medieval space worked. Today, a bedroom is often treated as one of the most private rooms in a home. In medieval households, the bedchamber could be intimate, but it was not always sealed from social life. In wealthier homes, beds might be impressive objects with hangings, textiles, and carved frames. Bed curtains could provide warmth and some visual separation. But servants might still enter. Visitors might be received near or even within chamber spaces depending on rank and custom. A chamber was private compared with the hall, but that privacy was relative. For ordinary people, sleeping could be far more communal. Family members might sleep in the same room, and sometimes in the same bed, depending on age, status, space, and necessity. Apprentices and servants might sleep in workshops, lofts, kitchens, or shared quarters. Travelers often shared beds at inns, not because it was charming, but because bedding was limited and space had value. The discomfort was not only physical. It meant that night, which modern people often imagine as the most private part of the day, could remain socially crowded. And night was not silent. Medieval homes could be noisy in ways that are hard to recreate now. The crackle of the hearth, the shifting of animals, the breathing and coughing of sleepers, the crying of infants, the creak of wood, the movement of servants, the sounds from the street, and the simple closeness of bodies all made sleep less solitary. Darkness did not automatically create privacy. It often created dependence because people gathered near warmth and safety. The issue of bodily privacy was even more difficult. Medieval people had customs of modesty, and those customs varied by region, class, gender, and setting. But the practical management of the body often happened in shared or semi-public conditions. Washing, dressing, relieving oneself, childbirth, sickness, and death were all less hidden than they are in many modern societies. A sick person was often cared for at home, in the presence of family and neighbors. Birth was attended by women of the community. Death took place in domestic spaces more often than in separate medical institutions. The human body was not as easily removed from common view. This did not mean people felt nothing about exposure. On the contrary, medieval culture could be deeply concerned with shame, honor, purity, and reputation. But discomfort did not automatically produce architectural solutions. A person might feel embarrassed and still have no separate room. A household might value modesty and still sleep together. A community might condemn improper behavior while making secrecy nearly impossible. The result was not a world without boundaries, but a world where boundaries were enforced by custom more than by walls. Clothing also belonged to this world of limited privacy. Getting dressed was not always a solitary ritual. Clothing was layered, practical, expensive, and socially meaningful. In wealthier households, servants assisted with dressing. In poorer ones, garments might be shared, repaired repeatedly, stored in chests, and put on in crowded rooms. A person's clothing told others about occupation, rank, wealth, and sometimes moral standing. You could not easily present yourself as entirely separate from your community, because the community understood the visible codes. The medieval chest, in this sense, becomes surprisingly important. If a person could not always have a private room, they might still have a private container. Chests held clothing, documents, money, tools, keepsakes, and household valuables. A locked chest could create a small island of personal control inside a crowded home. It was not privacy of space, but privacy of possession. To own something that could be closed, guarded, or locked was meaningful. It allowed secrets to become material. A letter, a coin, a piece of cloth, a small devotional object, a contract, or a family item could be separated from the eyes of others. But even this kind of privacy depended on trust and status. Locks were not universal. Many people had little worth locking away. A servant's belongings might be modest and vulnerable. A wife's access to property could be shaped by law and custom. A child's possessions were usually folded into household life. Personal ownership existed, but the household remained the stronger unit. In many cases, privacy was less about the individual and more about the family, the lineage, the craft, or the estate. This is one reason modern viewers sometimes misunderstand medieval domestic life. We often imagine the home as a refuge from society. For medieval people, the home was one of the main places where society happened. The threshold did not create a sharp division between private self and public world. Neighbors entered, clients arrived, workers labored, servants listened, children learned by watching. Food production, textile work, tool repair, brewing, animal care, and business could all unfold close to the bed, the fire, and the family table. In towns, shop fronts and homes were often connected. A baker, weaver, smith, tanner, tailor, or merchant might live near the place of work, and work near the place of sleep. The apprentice was not simply an employee. He might live in the master's house, eat at the household table, sleep under the same roof, and absorb both the craft and the household discipline. This arrangement made training intense and personal, but it also meant very little separation between professional life and domestic life. The master could supervise not only work, but behavior. The apprentice could see the household's tensions, habits, and secrets. Servants experienced this even more strongly. Domestic service brought a person into the intimate machinery of another household. Servants knew who rose early, who argued, who drank too much, who was generous, who was ill, who was careless with money, who received letters, who locked chests, and who whispered after dark. They were often expected to be present and invisible at the same time, which is one of the quiet contradictions of household service. Their labor made other people's comfort possible, but their own privacy could be extremely limited. For women, privacy was especially shaped by status, labor, reputation, and the body. In poorer households, women worked visibly. In fields, markets, kitchens, dairies, workshops, breweries, and homes. They moved through community spaces where their conduct was noticed. In wealthier households, elite women might have chambers and attendants, but they were also watched because their marriages, fertility, alliances, and household management mattered to family power. Neither poverty nor wealth guaranteed personal freedom from observation. They simply produced different forms of being watched. Marriage, too, was not just a private emotional arrangement. It joined property, labor, families, alliances, inheritance, and social reputation. Weddings were public because they mattered to the community. A union affected land, legitimacy, obligation, and household order. The modern idea that marriage belongs primarily to the private life of two individuals does not fully fit the medieval setting. The couple might share intimacy, affection, resentment, or companionship, but the marriage itself was embedded in a public web of expectations. And when privacy did appear, it could be morally suspicious. This is another subtle reversal. Modern people often treat privacy as healthy and necessary. Medieval communities often valued openness because secrecy could imply disorder, sin, theft, conspiracy, or dishonor. A person who hid too much might provoke concern. A young couple seeking too much secrecy could be judged. A servant acting privately might be suspected of disloyalty. A transaction without witnesses could be challenged. In a world where public reputation carried legal and social weight, being seen could protect you. Still, the cost was real. Imagine never being fully alone after a difficult day. Imagine grief happening beside the same hearth where someone is chopping kindling, stirring pottage, correcting a child, and negotiating tomorrow's labor. Imagine illness without a quiet room, embarrassment without a closed bathroom, marriage without a truly separate domestic sphere, childhood without personal space, and work without leaving the house. The pressure was not always dramatic. It was often ordinary. That is what made it so complete. The lack of privacy shaped emotion in slow, practical ways. People learned to control their expressions in front of others. They learned what not to say, when to speak quietly, when to rely on gesture, when to wait for a walk outside, when to choose the cover of darkness, when to use the church, the field edge, the market crowd, or the noise of work as a kind of privacy. They did not live without strategies. They found small pockets of concealment inside a world built for proximity. The church offers one of the most fascinating examples of this tension. It was one of the most public buildings in a medieval community, yet it also offered forms of inwardness. People gathered there together, stood under the same images, heard the same bells, watched the same rituals, and participated in the same calendar. But prayer could also be personal. A person might kneel in a shared sacred space while carrying private fears no one else could see. Confession, depending on period and practice, created another complicated boundary between secrecy and authority. Private conscience existed, but it was not entirely detached from public religious life. Monasteries and convents complicate the picture further. At first glance, a monastery might seem like a place of withdrawal from the world, and in some ways it was. But withdrawal did not mean privacy in the modern sense. Monastic life was communal by design. Monks or nuns prayed together, ate together, worked together, slept in dormitories, followed bells, obeyed rules, and lived under supervision. The goal was often not personal independence, but disciplined shared life. Silence could be valued, but silence is not the same as privacy. A person might have fewer worldly distractions and still be constantly embedded in a regulated community. In that sense, the monastery reveals something essential about medieval thinking. Being alone was not always treated as a right or a comfort. It could be spiritually powerful but also dangerous. Solitude might allow contemplation, but it could also invite temptation, pride, despair, or disorder, at least in the eyes of moral writers. Community corrected the individual. Routine guarded the soul. To be watched was not only social control, it could be understood as spiritual care. This attitude helps explain why the modern celebration of personal space does not map neatly onto the medieval world. Medieval society was built around households, guilds, parishes, manors, kinship groups, religious communities, and sworn relationships. Identity was relational. You were known as someone's child, spouse, servant, master, tenant, lord, neighbor, apprentice, parishioner, debtor, creditor, or dependent. To be entirely private would have been, in many settings, to be strangely disconnected. Yet this does not mean medieval people were comfortable all the time. They endured a level of exposure that many modern people would find exhausting. The most intimate parts of life were softened by habit, but habit is not the same as ease. People may have accepted crowded sleeping arrangements because they were normal, but normal things can still be tiring. They may have expected neighbors to know their affairs, but that did not make gossip harmless. They may have valued communal oversight, but that did not prevent shame, resentment, or the desire to slip briefly out of sight. One of the quietest forms of privacy may have been movement. A person walking to the fields before sunrise, carrying tools through mist and cold air, might have found a few moments away from the press of the household. A woman going to draw water might exchange words beyond the hearing of men in the house. A shepherd, a carter, a peddler, or a traveler might experience stretches of physical distance unavailable to someone confined to domestic work. Roads were dangerous and uncertain, but they could also create temporary anonymity. Travel, however, brought its own loss of privacy. Inns were communal spaces. Beds might be shared. Meals were public. Strangers listened. Hosts observed. Stable yards, common rooms, and sleeping chambers blurred together. A traveler carried not only goods and money, but vulnerability. Without the protection of familiar neighbors, the traveler became dependent on reputation, letters, companions, clothing, speech, and the hospitality of others. The road offered distance from home, but not necessarily solitude. Even the castle, which modern imagination often turns into a place of secret corridors and hidden chambers, was usually a crowded working environment. It housed soldiers, servants, cooks, clerks, grooms, chaplains, guests, messengers, craftsmen, children, animals, and stores. The walls protected the household from enemies, but inside those walls life was noisy and layered. The kitchen smoked and clattered. The hall filled with voices. The courtyard carried the sound of hooves, tools, and commands. Guards watched gates. Servants carried information as easily as they carried water. A castle's private spaces, where they existed, were signs of hierarchy. The deeper you moved from gate to hall to chamber, the more controlled access became. But controlled access did not mean emotional privacy. It meant rank. Who could enter, who had to wait, who could approach the lord, who could speak in the chamber, who slept nearby, who served at table, who guarded the door. All of these details expressed power. Privacy was not evenly distributed. It flowed upward. And this brings us to a larger truth about medieval life. Privacy was a form of wealth. Not only wealth in money, but wealth in space, time, status, and control. To decide when others could see you was power. To have a chamber of your own was power. To keep servants outside a door was power. To own a lockable chest was power. To have enough fuel for a smaller room, enough candles for separate activity, enough servants to carry messages instead of receiving visitors yourself. these were not minor comforts. They were signs that the world bent, even slightly, around your needs. For most people, the world did not bend that way. The world pressed inward. The walls were close, the seasons demanding, the household crowded, and the community attentive. A person's life unfolded within sight and sound of others because that was how the economy, the family, the parish, and the manor held together. Privacy was not absent by accident. It was limited by the structure of survival. But there is still one more layer to this. The Middle Ages were not static. Across centuries, regions, and classes, ideas of household space changed. Towns grew, wealth shifted, building styles developed, domestic arrangements became more complex in some places. The desire for more specialized rooms gradually became more visible among elites and prosperous urban households. The story of medieval privacy is therefore not simply a story of people living crowded forever. It is also the beginning of a long, uneven movement toward the more divided interior spaces that later generations would come to expect. And to see that change beginning, we have to look more closely at the medieval rooms themselves. The hall, the chamber, the kitchen, the loft, the solar, the garderobe, the workshop, and the bed. Because each one tells us not only where people lived, but how much of themselves they were allowed to keep unseen. The hall, especially, was the great open stage of medieval domestic life. In a noble household, it was where meals were served, visitors were received, servants waited, judgments were heard, accounts were discussed, and the hierarchy of the house could be seen almost at a glance. In a smaller home, the hall or main room might be far less grand, but it still carried the same basic idea. This was the place where household life gathered. It was not a living room in the modern sense because it was not built around leisure or personal comfort. It was closer to a working center, a dining space, a receiving room, and a social theater all at once. To sleep in such a world meant understanding that the house did not become private simply because the sun went down. In larger households, lower status members often slept in or near the hall after the day's activity ended. Benches, pallets, rushes, straw, cloaks, and temporary bedding could turn a public room into a sleeping area. A space that had held conversation, meals, servants, dogs, smoke, spills, and visitors by day could hold exhausted bodies by night. The transformation was practical rather than intimate. The room did not belong to the sleeper. The sleeper belonged temporarily to the room. And that distinction matters. Modern privacy is often built around the idea that a room can be yours. Medieval space was more often defined by who had permission to use it, when they used it, and under whose authority. The hall belonged to the household head, but many people occupied it. The kitchen belonged to the work of feeding the household, but servants spent much of their lives there. The chamber might belong to a lord or lady, but attendants entered it. The workshop might belong to a master, but apprentices slept near the tools. A room was not simply a container for individual identity. It was a container for obligation. In grander houses, the hall also made privacy visible by contrast. Everyone knew that some people could withdraw from it and others could not. The lord might rise from the high table and retreat into a chamber. The lady might pass into a more controlled inner space. Important guests might be taken away from the common crowd. Servants remained. Lesser retainers waited. The ability to leave the public room became a quiet sign of rank. You did not have to announce privilege when your body could simply disappear behind another door. The chamber beyond the hall, therefore, became one of the most important medieval spaces in the story of privacy. It was not always a bedroom in the narrow modern sense. It could be a place for sleeping, receiving select visitors, storing valuables, conducting business, speaking more discreetly, resting, or displaying refined domestic status. In elite households, chambers might be warmed, furnished, hung with textiles, and arranged to offer a degree of comfort that the hall could not provide. Tapestries and hangings were not merely decorative. They softened stone walls, reduced drafts, held warmth, improved acoustics, and created an atmosphere of separation. But even here, privacy remained layered. A lord in his chamber was not necessarily alone. He might be accompanied by servants, clerks, advisors, pages, chaplains, physicians, relatives, guests, or petitioners of higher rank. The chamber did not remove him from society. It filtered society. Instead of the broad public of the hall, he entered a smaller circle. In that smaller circle, more confidential matters could be discussed, but the presence of others remained normal. Important medieval people were rarely unattended because attendance itself was part of service, security, honor, and display. For noble women, the chamber could carry even more delicate meanings. It was sometimes associated with domestic management, textile work, child-rearing, female companionship, prayer, and the guarded world of reputation. Yet it was not simply a hidden feminine sanctuary. Elite women could manage estates, direct servants, receive guests, arrange marriages, oversee production, and participate in political life through household networks. Their chambers might offer greater seclusion than the hall, but that seclusion was not the same as powerlessness. It was a controlled space, and control could be both protective and limiting. The solar, where it existed, sharpened this distinction further. The word itself is often associated with a private upper room in a medieval house, a place more withdrawn than the hall and sometimes better lit, warmer, and more comfortable. It is tempting to imagine the solar as the beginning of the modern private room, and in some ways it was part of that long development. But even the solar belonged to a household order, not to modern individualism. It was private because access was restricted, not because personal solitude was considered an everyday right. The same is true of bed curtains. To modern eyes, a bed enclosed by curtains can look romantic, theatrical, or luxurious. In medieval conditions, it was also practical. Curtains helped retain warmth. They reduced drafts. They offered some visual separation in rooms where other people might be present. They softened the feeling of exposure. But they were not soundproof, and they did not remove the sleeper from the household. A bed curtain created a small pocket of controlled sight, not a sealed private world. Still, that pocket mattered. It reminds us that medieval people did create boundaries when they could. They used screens, curtains, chests, alcoves, upper rooms, locked doors, and rules of access. They arranged bodies by rank. They separated men and women in some settings. They controlled who could approach a bed, a chamber, a chest, or a person of status. The story is not that medieval people lacked any idea of privacy. The story is that privacy was fragile, uneven, and usually attached to function, hierarchy, or modesty rather than personal autonomy. The kitchen offers another view of the same world. In modern imagination, the kitchen can be domestic and familiar, but in a medieval great household it was often a powerful, noisy, smoky, labor-intensive space, sometimes physically separated from the hall because of fire risk, smell, heat, and work. It was not a quiet family room. It was a production zone. Cooks, scullions, servants, boys, messengers, and suppliers might move through it constantly. Meat, fish, bread, ale, vegetables, spices, firewood, water, grease, smoke, and waste all passed through the routines of feeding many mouths. For those who worked there, privacy was almost impossible. The kitchen watched the worker through labor itself. A servant's pace, skill, mistakes, hunger, fatigue, and temperament could be noticed by others. There was little room for the modern separation between one's personal mood and one's public performance. A tired kitchen servant still had to rise before others, carry fuel, manage heat, wash vessels, prepare food, and endure the closeness of other workers. Even the body's exhaustion was not private, because exhaustion showed in the way a person moved. In poorer homes, where cooking happened in the main room, the problem was even more compressed. The hearth was warmth, light, cooking place, gathering point, and sometimes sleeping companion. Smoke might drift through the room. Food smells mingled with animals, damp clothing, rushes, bedding, and human breath. A family could not simply close off the mess of life into specialized rooms. The cooking pot, the child's pallet, the old person's stool, the repaired shoe, the spinning distaff, and the sleeping dog might all belong to the same interior landscape. This is where privacy and smell come together in a way modern people often forget. Privacy is not only about being seen. It is also about what others can hear, smell, and infer. In crowded medieval interiors, the senses were communal. Smoke announced the hearth. Damp wool carried the weather inside. Cooking revealed what a household could afford. Illness could have a smell. Animals could not be hidden easily. Bodies, bedding, waste, and work all left traces. Even if no one spoke, the household gave itself away. The garderobe or latrine space in castles and some larger buildings shows the uncomfortable limits of medieval bodily privacy. In grand settings, a garderobe could be built into a wall or tower, sometimes with a chute leading downward. This provided separation from living spaces, but not in a way modern sanitation would recognize. Could be cold, drafty, smelly, and shared. In towns, waste disposal varied widely and could involve cesspits, chamber pots, backyard privies, streets, streams, or arrangements that modern people would find deeply unpleasant. Bodily privacy existed in degrees, but the practical handling of waste tied the body back to the household, the street, and the labor of others. That labor is important. One person's modesty often depended on another person's service. Chamber pots had to be emptied. Linens had to be washed. Bedding had to be aired. Rushes had to be changed. Water had to be carried. Fires had to be managed. In elite households, the appearance of refinement rested on the often invisible work of servants. But the servants themselves saw everything. The cleaner the noble life appeared on the surface, the more labor was required beneath it, and the less private the noble body became to those who served it. This creates another reversal worth lingering over. The higher a person rose in status, the more elaborate their comfort could become, but also the more people were needed to maintain that comfort. A noble could sleep behind curtains, but servants made the bed. A lady could change garments in a chamber, but attendants helped with the clothing. A lord could dine with ceremony, but dozens of eyes watched the arrangement of food, cloth, cups, and gestures. Luxury did not remove witnesses. It reorganized them. For ordinary medieval people, the loft could sometimes offer a different kind of separation. In small houses, raised sleeping areas, storage lofts, or upper platforms might create a little distance from the main room. This was not always comfortable. Lofts could be cramped, smoky, dusty, cold in some seasons and hot in others. Yet even a poor loft could feel like a slight escape from the immediate press of the hearth. Children, servants, apprentices, or stored goods might occupy such spaces, depending on the household. The loft reminds us that privacy could be vertical as well as horizontal. A few steps upward might create a boundary, even if it did not create true solitude. Workshops, however, pulled that boundary apart again. In medieval towns, many crafts were practiced within or beside the home. A weaver's loom, a cobbler's bench, a smith's tools, a baker's oven, a brewer's vessels, a tailor's table, or a merchant's stored goods could shape the domestic interior. The household was not only where people recovered from work, it was where work continued. This meant that the eyes of customers, apprentices, suppliers, and neighbors could enter the household economy. The front of the house might open onto the street, and the street might feel almost like an extension of the room. In such places, children learned early that life was observed. They watched adults bargain, labor, quarrel, pray, eat, and sleep. They learned the craft not only by instruction but by constant exposure. They learned family tensions because there was nowhere else for tensions to go. They learned shame, rank, gender expectations, and manners because these things were performed all around them. Childhood privacy, in the modern sense, was limited. A child might not have a private bedroom, private possessions, or private time. But a child did have the rich, sometimes overwhelming education of shared life. For apprentices, the lack of privacy was part of discipline. To enter a master's household was to enter an arrangement that governed labor, behavior, food, sleep, movement, and sometimes morality. An apprentice's mistakes were public inside the workshop. His laziness, skill, obedience, and habits were visible. The master had an interest not only in the apprentice's hands, but in his character, because craft reputation depended on trust. The apprentice's life could be shaped by correction at close range. This intimacy could produce skill, loyalty, and belonging. It could also produce resentment, exhaustion, and a powerful desire for independence. Servants lived under similar scrutiny, though their conditions varied enormously. Some might be treated with relative stability within a household. Others could be vulnerable to harsh discipline, overwork, suspicion, or dismissal. Because they lived where they worked, escape from authority was limited. Even leisure could be watched. A servant laughing too freely, speaking too privately, receiving attention, misplacing an item, or lingering too long outside might attract notice. The household that gave shelter also absorbed the servant's personal life. And yet servants were also watchers. They held knowledge. In a world of limited privacy, information moved through those who cleaned, carried, cooked, dressed, fetched, opened doors, closed shutters, and slept near thresholds. A household's secrets were rarely known only by its owners. Servants could become trusted confidants, dangerous witnesses, quiet protectors, or sources of gossip. The more private a household tried to be, the more it depended on people who knew what privacy was hiding. The same pattern appeared in villages, though without the formal structure of a great house. Neighbors became witnesses by proximity. The woman at the well, the man at the mill, the child sent with a message, the priest, the reeve, the midwife, the alewife, the plow team, the harvest group, each carried fragments of knowledge. Medieval community was built from these fragments. A household's reputation was not formed by one official record, but by repeated sightings, remembered words, patterns of behavior, debts repaid or avoided, quarrels settled or revived. The mill was one of the places where this could become especially visible. Grain had to be ground, and in many manorial settings peasants were obliged to use the lord's mill. This made the mill not merely an economic site, but a social bottleneck. People came, waited, talked, complained, watched quantities, noticed shortages, heard rumors, and measured one another's fortunes in sacks and flour. A family's harvest, hunger, and obligations could become partly visible there. Even food, before it reached the privacy of the cooking pot, passed through a public system. The well or water source served a similar role, especially for women and children who carried water as part of daily work. A trip for water could be exhausting, but it was also social. News traveled, judgments formed, friendships and tensions deepened. In a world with few private channels of communication, ordinary chores created the network. This is why medieval privacy cannot be understood only by looking inside buildings. The routines that sustained the household constantly carried people outside it, into places where domestic life became visible. The church, too, gathered visibility into rhythm. On Sundays and feast days, people did not simply worship as isolated souls. They appeared as members of a community. Their clothing, attendance, posture, companions, offerings, absences, and behavior could all be noticed. The parish church was sacred space, but it was also social space. It placed the poor, the prosperous, the old, the young, the respectable, the troubled, and the ambitious within sight of one another. Even spiritual life had a public dimension. Confession complicates this again. The idea of confessing sins suggests privacy of conscience, and in one sense it confirms that medieval people understood inward life deeply. Sin was not only an outward act. It could be intention, desire, fear, resentment, pride, or secret failure. Yet confession also placed inward life within a religious structure. The private soul was not left entirely to itself. It was examined, spoken, guided, and judged according to the teachings and authority of the Church. Medieval privacy of conscience existed, but it was connected to discipline, not modern personal self-expression. There is a quiet emotional weight in this. A person could carry private guilt in a crowded home, private grief in a public church, private desire under the watch of family, private anger beside a shared fire. The inner life did not disappear because rooms were crowded. It may, in some cases, have become more intense because it had fewer easy outlets. People learned patience, concealment, coded speech, and endurance. They also learned to rely on rituals that could hold emotion when private space could not. Death was perhaps the most powerful example. Today, death is often moved into hospitals, care homes, funeral services, and professional systems. In the medieval world, death was more commonly domestic and communal. A dying person might be surrounded by family, neighbors, clergy, servants, or members of a religious community. The preparation of the body, prayers, mourning, burial, and remembrance were all deeply social. This could be comforting because no one was abandoned to institutional loneliness. It could also mean that the final vulnerability of the body was witnessed by many. Birth, too, was communal in ways modern viewers may find difficult to imagine. Childbirth usually belonged to female spaces of assistance, knowledge, and risk. Midwives, female relatives, neighbors, and attendants might gather. The event was intensely bodily, but not private in the modern couple-centered sense. It was a household and community matter because birth affected inheritance, labor, lineage, survival, and spiritual duty. A newborn child entered not only a family, but a web of witnesses. Marriage began in public, birth unfolded with attendants, sickness drew helpers and observers, death gathered a community, work took place near home, food passed through shared systems, and worship was collective. At every major threshold of life, medieval people were surrounded. The individual stood inside circles of obligation. This is perhaps the central difference between then and now. The medieval self was less often imagined as a sealed interior world and more often lived as a node in a visible network. But we should not make that sound simpler than it was. The same closeness that supported survival could become suffocating. The same neighbors who helped in hardship could spread rumors. The same household that offered belonging could trap people in constant supervision. The same public rituals that gave meaning could expose shame. The same servants who made comfort possible could carry secrets beyond the chamber. Community was not purely warm. It was necessary, watchful, protective, intrusive, and sometimes unforgiving. In legal life, the importance of witnesses reinforced this culture of visibility. Agreements, disputes, property transfers, marriages, debts, apprenticeships, and accusations often depended on who had seen, heard, remembered, or could testify. Written documents existed and grew in importance across the medieval centuries, but ordinary truth still relied heavily on human memory and public knowledge. To do something openly was to give it weight. To do something secretly was to risk denial, suspicion, or weakness. That is why public shame could be such a powerful tool. Punishments and penances often worked by exposure. A person might be made visible in order to correct behavior, restore order, or warn others. The point was not merely to punish the body, but to alter reputation. In a world where reputation was one of a person's most valuable forms of social currency, being publicly marked mattered. Privacy protected dignity. Exposure could damage it. Medieval society understood this very well, even if it did not give most people the architectural privacy modern people expect. The public nature of shame also tells us that people did value concealment. If exposure hurt, then privacy had meaning. If gossip could wound, then secrecy mattered. If modesty needed protection, then boundaries existed. The difference is that many boundaries were social rather than physical. A custom might forbid certain eyes, even when walls could not. A curtain might signal respect. A threshold might mark permission. A rule about who could enter a birthing room, who could attend a lady, who could approach a lord's chamber, or who could examine a chest could create privacy through behavior. So the medieval world was full of invisible lines. They were not always built of stone or timber. They were built of rank, gender, age, authority, reputation, ritual, and fear of judgment. A person might know not to step beyond a certain point, not to listen too openly, not to speak of what had been seen, not to enter a chamber uninvited, not to touch another household's goods, not to look too boldly at a person dressing or grieving. These rules were imperfect and often broken, but they mattered. The more we look, the more medieval privacy appears not as an absence, but as a negotiation under pressure. People negotiated privacy with architecture, with cloth, with time of day, with silence, with rank, with religious practice, with distance, with locks, with witnesses, with secrecy, and with trust. Some had more tools than others. A lord had chambers. A merchant had a counting room or locked storage. A monk had regulated silence. A peasant had perhaps a field path, a chest, a corner, or the brief darkness before sleep. A servant might have almost nothing except discretion. This is why the later development of more specialized domestic rooms was so important. As some households gained wealth, as urban life expanded, as building techniques and domestic expectations evolved, interior space could become more divided. The emergence of more chambers, studies, closets, withdrawing rooms, and specialized sleeping spaces in later medieval and early modern households did not happen all at once. But the desire for separation became easier to express when material conditions allowed it. Privacy did not simply appear because people became more modern in their feelings. It expanded when walls, money, fuel, furniture, and social habits made it possible. Even then, change came unevenly. A prosperous townhouse might develop more private rooms while a rural cottage remained crowded. A noble household might refine access to chambers while servants still slept in shared quarters. A monastery might maintain communal discipline while individual devotional practices deepened. A merchant might keep accounts in a more controlled space while apprentices remained under watch. The history of privacy is not a straight road from crowded to comfortable. It is a patchwork, shaped by class, gender, region, law, religion, economy, and architecture. And now, to understand what that patchwork felt like at the level of daily life, we have to move through an ordinary medieval day from morning to night. Not as a list of customs, but as a sequence of moments in which privacy was constantly tested. Waking beside others, dressing under watchful eyes, stepping into the yard, working in public, sharing meals, managing bodily needs, listening at church, returning to a smoky room, and finally trying to sleep in a darkness that still belonged to everyone. Trying to sleep in a darkness that still belonged to everyone meant that the medieval day did not begin with the private awakening modern people often know. There was rarely a soft boundary between sleep and society. A person might wake because another body shifted nearby, because a child stirred, because an animal moved, because the fire had fallen too low, because someone rose before dawn to begin work, or because the cold had crept through the walls and made lying still impossible. Morning did not arrive as a personal choice. It entered the room through necessity. In a crowded household, waking was often a shared event, even when people woke at different moments. One person rising could disturb several others. A servant moving toward the hearth might step around bedding. A mother might tend a child before the room was fully light. A father might reach for clothing or tools close to where others still slept. An apprentice might be shaken awake by duty, not by restfulness. The day began with the body already known to others. Its tiredness, its smell, its stiffness, its reluctance, its hunger. There was little chance to compose oneself before being seen. This is one of the small realities that makes medieval privacy so different. Modern life often gives a person a few private minutes between sleep and public identity. Medieval life frequently removed that interval. The face before washing, the cough before speech, the irritation before self-control, the slow rising of an aching body, these belonged to the room. Even silence could be shared. A person could lie awake among others and still be surrounded by breath, warmth, movement, and obligation. The first task of morning was often not expression, but maintenance. The fire might need attention. Ashes might be stirred. Embers might be coaxed back into usefulness. Water might be fetched. Animals might need feeding or checking. Clothing, if damp or cold, had to be pulled on in the presence of others. Bedding might be shaken, folded, pushed aside, or left near the wall. In wealthier households, servants handled much of this labor, but that only shifted the problem of privacy. The lord or lady had more comfort, yet the servant entered the intimate space of waking. The poor had fewer attendants, but more crowded necessity. Dressing, in particular, reveals how visible the body could be. Clothing was not merely a private layer between the self and the world. It was labor, status, protection, modesty, and identity all at once. In ordinary homes, garments might be put on in a room where family members were also rising, working, speaking, or preparing food. People knew how to avert their eyes, how to move with modesty, how to use layers and habits to preserve dignity. But these were social skills, not architectural guarantees. Person did not always dress alone. They dressed within the choreography of shared space. Among the better off, dressing could become more elaborate, but not necessarily more private. Servants assisted with garments, fastenings, belts, head coverings, shoes, and outer layers. For elite men and women, the dressed body was a carefully managed social object. Clothing displayed rank, taste, wealth, and propriety. It required help. To be served in dressing was a privilege, but it also meant that the body was never entirely self-contained. The noble body was protected from public disorder by being made dependent on private attendance. Hair, coverings, belts, knives, purses, keys, and small objects all had to be arranged before the person fully entered the day. Keys especially mattered because they marked control. A key to a chest, a storeroom, a chamber, a coffer, or a pantry could represent authority within the household. The person who held keys held access. In a world where privacy was scarce, control over storage was a powerful substitute. A locked place could preserve goods, documents, food, cloth, coin, or tools from the common flow of eyes and hands. The morning act of taking up keys could quietly signal who governed the hidden parts of the house. But for many people, The morning quickly carried them out of whatever small domestic boundaries existed. In a village, the path to work was not a private commute. It was part of a visible rhythm. Doors opened, smoke rose, animals were driven out, tools were carried. Neighbors saw who left early, who lingered, who looked unwell, who had help, who lacked it. The landscape itself encouraged visibility. Open fields, common pastures, lanes, mills, wells, and church paths created repeated encounters. Even before the labor of the day fully began, the community had started reading itself. A person's absence could speak as loudly as presence. If someone failed to appear in the fields, others might wonder why. Illness, laziness, conflict, grief, pregnancy, debt, drunkenness, or domestic trouble could all be guessed before they were known. This did not mean every neighbor was malicious. Often the noticing was practical. Work depended on timing. Animals depended on care. Shared obligations depended on participation. But practical attention could easily become moral attention. The medieval village was not built for anonymity. The well. The day's privacy could thin even further. Water was essential, heavy, and often social. Those who carried it did not merely collect a resource. They entered a place where news gathered almost naturally. A household's needs could be inferred from how often water was drawn, who came to fetch it, what was said, what was not said, and whether someone seemed troubled. The well could offer a brief escape from the interior pressure of home, but it also placed a person inside another kind of visibility. One crowded space gave way to another. The mill worked in a similar way, though through food rather than water. Grain carried to be ground revealed something about a household's harvest, planning, and dependence. People waited, measured, complained, joked, suspected, and compared. The Lord's rights, the miller's honesty, the quality of grain, the size of sacks, the timing of grinding, all could become subjects of conversation. A family's survival passed through a place where others could see and comment. Bread, before it became domestic, was already social. For those working in fields, privacy was limited by shared labor and open land. The body bent, lifted, cut, dug, scattered seed, gathered sheaves, repaired fences, guided animals, and endured weather in view of others. Fatigue could not be hidden easily. Skill could be judged. Pace could be compared. A person who worked poorly might be mocked or corrected. A person who worked well might be respected, envied, or relied upon. Even silence in the field was not solitary, because everyone knew the rhythm of everyone else's body. Season changed the feeling of exposure. In summer, longer light stretched the working day and made more movement visible. In winter, darkness came earlier, but the pressure of shared interiors increased. Cold narrowed people's choices. The need for warmth drove bodies back toward the hearth. The rainy season, muddy roads, damp clothing, and poor light could make separation harder. Weather was not just background. It shaped the amount of privacy a person could physically sustain. A warm day might allow someone to slip outside for air. A freezing night pulled everyone inward. In towns, the morning opened differently but no less publicly. Shutters were lifted. Goods were arranged. Tools came out. Apprentices swept thresholds. Shop fronts faced the street. A craftsperson's work began within earshot of neighbors, customers, and competitors. A baker's fire, a smith's hammer, a tanner's smell, a brewer's vessels, a weaver's loom, a tailor's bench, each announced itself. The town was full of trades that could not easily hide their existence. Work had sound, scent, and rhythm. Urban privacy was also shaped by the vertical closeness of buildings. Families might live above shops. Lodgers might share rooms. Rear yards might hold animals, storage, waste, and work. Walls were close enough for sound to travel. A quarrel in one house could become knowledge in another. A child crying, a couple arguing, a servant being scolded, a customer complaining, a debt being pressed. These things could pass through timber and plaster as easily as smoke passed through roof openings. Towns offered opportunity, but they also multiplied witnesses. And yet the town also offered one thing the village often could not: partial anonymity. A person in a larger town could sometimes disappear into a crowd, enter a market, visit a church, cross a bridge, or pass through a lane without being known by everyone. This did not create modern privacy, but it created a different kind of freedom. The same density that made houses noisy could make streets impersonal. One could be watched by many and recognized by few. That, too, was a medieval form of concealment. This is why the market was so complex. It was one of the least private places imaginable, full of bargaining, weighing, calling, touching goods, examining animals, checking coins, and watching faces. But it was also a place where identity could loosen slightly. Travelers arrived. Strangers passed through. Rural people entered urban space. Women and men negotiated purchases. Servants bought on behalf of households. News moved faster than certainty. In the market, one could be exposed and hidden at the same time. Meals brought the day's visibility back into the household. Eating was rarely an entirely private act. In ordinary homes, food preparation and eating often happened in the same crowded area where other work continued. The pot revealed what could be afforded. The amount of bread, ale, pottage, cheese, onions, fish, meat, or beans could speak of season and status. Hunger was hard to conceal when meals were shared. A family knew who received more, who received less, who was favored, who was ill, who had labored hardest, and who had disappointed the household. In larger households, meals became even more public. The hall arranged bodies by rank. Where one sat, what one was served, how one behaved, how close one came to the high table, and who ate after whom could all communicate status. Servants watched diners, and diners watched one another. Eating was a social ritual, not merely a bodily need. The body's appetite became part of hierarchy. A lord could display generosity through food. A guest could display manners. A servant could display competence. Even chewing belonged to the order of the house. This may seem like a small detail, but it changes how we understand comfort. A modern person often associates a meal with personal taste or family intimacy. A medieval meal could certainly be intimate, warm, and familiar, but it was also structured by rank, scarcity, religious fasting, seasonal supply, and communal expectation. You might not eat when you wanted, where you wanted, or with whom you wanted. The meal was a moment when the household saw itself. Privacy yielded to order. The same was true of rest. A pause in the day did not necessarily mean retreat. A worker might sit by a wall, under a tree, near a doorway, or beside others in the field. A servant might snatch a moment in a kitchen corner. An apprentice might lean briefly near the shop. A mother might rest while still watching children, food, animals, or work. The body could stop moving, but the social world did not vanish. Even tiredness might have to be performed carefully. To seem idle could invite criticism. To seem too exhausted could reveal weakness. To rest openly was sometimes to invite judgment about whether one had earned it. This is one of the more quietly uncomfortable parts of medieval life without privacy. Exhaustion was visible. Illness was visible. Poverty was visible. Domestic tension was visible. The marks of life could not be tucked away easily. A torn garment, a hollow face, an unpaid debt, a missing animal, a broken tool, a thin harvest, a troubled marriage, a badly kept house. Each could become known through ordinary contact. The community did not need to invade. Life leaked outward. Bodily needs created perhaps the most persistent challenge. The modern bathroom is one of the strongest symbols of private life, and medieval society had nothing equivalent for most people. There were places for waste, washing, and bodily care, but they varied greatly by class, region, and setting. Chamber pots, privies, yards, fields, latrines, streams, bathhouses, and improvised arrangements all existed in different contexts. Some were more discreet than others. Few offered the complete privacy and sanitation modern people expect. This does not mean medieval people were indifferent to cleanliness or modesty. That is one of the common misunderstandings. They washed hands, faces, linens, utensils, and bodies in ways shaped by access to water, fuel, soap, labor, climate, and custom. They understood foul smells, contamination in practical terms, and the importance of clean presentation. But maintaining bodily dignity required work, and work required space, water, heat, containers, cloth, and time. In crowded households, every act of washing or changing had to be fitted into the presence of others. Public bathhouses existed in many medieval towns, especially in certain periods and places, and they remind us again that the medieval body was not always hidden. Bathing could be social, commercial, practical, and morally debated. In some towns, bathhouses were common features of urban life, though attitudes shifted over time and varied widely. A bathhouse offered cleansing and warmth, but not necessarily privacy. It might provide a controlled public intimacy, a place where bodies were managed in company rather than concealed in solitude. For women, bodily visibility was shaped by strict expectations and practical realities. Menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, washing, and dressing all took place within a world that valued modesty but often denied seclusion. Female networks helped manage this. Women assisted one another. Knowledge passed through mothers, neighbors, midwives, servants, and older relatives. Certain spaces and moments became female-controlled, not private in the individual sense, but protected from male intrusion. This was a different kind of privacy, communal privacy, guarded by shared custom. For men, too, privacy was limited, though in different ways. Male work often took place in public or semi-public settings. Fields, workshops, markets, roads, courts, guild spaces, taverns, ships, stables, building sites, and military camps. Masculine reputation depended heavily on visible conduct. Strength, reliability, honor, restraint, skill, credit, and public behavior. A man who failed in work, debt, courage, or household discipline could be known. His body and actions were measured by other men as well as by the wider community. The tavern or alehouse is especially revealing. It could offer release from household supervision, a place for talk, drink, news, games, argument, and companionship. But it was not private. It was another public interior. Words spoken there might travel. Behavior there might shape reputation. Debts might be made. Insults might be remembered. Friendships might form under the eyes of others. The alehouse could feel freer than the home, but it was not free from witnesses. It simply changed the audience. The church bells, meanwhile, reminded everyone that time itself was not entirely personal. The day was structured by religious sound, labor demands, daylight, meals, markets, and household authority. People did not always arrange time according to private preference. Bells called communities to prayer, marked hours, announced events, warned of danger, and shaped expectation. In monasteries, this was even more formal, with the daily office regulating sleep, prayer, work, reading, and silence. In towns and villages, time was less mechanically precise than in modern life, but it was still social. The individual moved within a shared rhythm. As the day bent toward evening, privacy did not necessarily increase. In some ways, it narrowed. The return home brought people back into the room or rooms where all the unsolved business of the day gathered. Tools had to be put away. Animals had to be secured. Food had to be prepared. Children had to be managed. Fires had to be fed. Clothing had to dry. Injuries, complaints, quarrels, debts, and worries came indoors. Evening could be comforting, but it was rarely empty. The hearth drew the household together again. Around it, people might eat, work by dim light, tell stories, repair objects, spin, sew, sharpen, pray, argue, or sit in fatigue. The fire made community possible, but it also made solitude difficult. Light gathered people into one visible circle. Beyond that circle lay darkness, cold, and uncertainty. A person who wanted to be alone might find that the only private space was also the least comfortable one. The warm place was the shared place. This created a daily emotional bargain. To be warm was to be watched. To be safe was to be near others. To be fed was to participate in household order. To be known was to be protected, judged, and remembered. Medieval people did not choose between privacy and community in the abstract. They navigated hundreds of small bargains. A little warmth in exchange for exposure, a little help in exchange for obligation, a little reputation in exchange for scrutiny, a little safety in exchange for noise. Nightfall intensified these bargains. In households with only limited artificial light, candles and lamps were precious. Darkness could create cover, but it also limited movement. People stayed near known spaces. The bed, pallet, bench, or straw bedding became the next shared territory. Clothes might be loosened, outer garments removed, tools placed nearby, children settled, animals quieted if possible. In some places, doors were barred not for privacy, but for protection. The household closed itself against the outside world, but inside the closure, people remained exposed to one another. In wealthier households, the movement toward sleep had ceremony and service. Fires might be prepared in chambers. Beds might be warmed. Curtains might be drawn. Nightclothes, washing water, candles, and prayers might be arranged. But again, service meant presence. Privacy was performed through attendance before it was enjoyed. Someone prepared the chamber. Someone carried the candle. Someone closed the hangings. Someone knew who entered and who remained. The night of the elite was softer, but not unseen. For poorer households, the night was more compressed. Several people might settle into the same room. Bedding might be shared for warmth. The old and young might lie near the fire. The floor could be hard, the straw imperfect, the air smoky, the walls damp. Fleas, lice, mice, or other pests might disturb rest. Someone's cough could keep others awake. Someone's sorrow might be felt through silence. Someone's anger might remain in the room because there was nowhere else for it to go. And still people slept. They adapted. They found familiarity in the breathing of the household. They learned the sounds of their own rooms. They understood the difference between ordinary noise and danger. They knew who turned restlessly, who rose early, who muttered in sleep, who crept quietly, who snored, who cried, who prayed. The lack of privacy did not make life meaningless. It made life intensely shared. This shared intensity may have shaped memory itself. In a world where so many experiences happened in company, personal memory was often reinforced by others. A childhood event, a marriage negotiation, a quarrel, a feast, a sickness, a bad harvest, a harsh winter, a strange traveler, a public punishment, a fire, a theft. These were remembered not only by individuals but by groups. The community held stories that could preserve truth, but it could also preserve humiliation. To be remembered by others was a blessing and a burden. Late at night, When most of the room had quieted, the closest thing to solitude might arrive not through space, but through inwardness. A person could lie still among others and think privately. Thoughts could move where bodies could not. A prayer could be silent. A fear could be unnamed. A hope could be hidden. A resentment could be carried without speech. The medieval world could crowd the body, but it could not fully occupy the mind. Perhaps this is why inward religious life, memory, dreams, and conscience mattered so deeply. They offered an interior chamber no architecture could easily provide. Yet even the mind was shaped by the shared world. Dreams might be interpreted through religious teaching. Fears might be communal fears. Hunger, judgment, disease, war, debt, childbirth, bad weather, sin, dishonor. Hopes might be household hopes. A good marriage, a safe birth, a better harvest, a surviving child, a fair bargain, a kindermaster, a healed body. The inner life was private, but its materials came from the world everyone inhabited together. As the night deepened, the room held all of this without needing to speak. Rank and affection, irritation and duty, bodily closeness and emotional distance, warmth and discomfort, protection and exposure. The medieval household was not simply a place where people lacked privacy. It was a place where the meaning of privacy had to be invented again and again, in gestures, timings, curtains, silences, shared rules, and small acts of restraint. And when the next morning came, the same pattern began again, though never exactly the same way. The household opened its eyes, the village paths filled, the shutters lifted, the fields called, the bells sounded, and every person stepped back into a world where being seen was not an interruption of life, but one of its basic conditions. From there, the question becomes even more interesting. How did people protect secrets, emotions, love, conflict, and personal dignity when almost everything around them encouraged exposure? The answer begins with the fact that medieval people did not protect dignity only by hiding. They protected it through conduct. In a world where walls could not always guard the self, manners, restraint, ritual, and shared expectations became a kind of invisible architecture. A person learned when not to stare, when not to ask, when to pretend not to hear, when to speak indirectly, when to give someone the cover of ordinary politeness. Privacy was not always a room. Sometimes it was a decision made by other people to look away. This may be one of the hardest things for a modern listener to feel fully. Modern privacy often depends on devices, doors, passwords, legal rights, and personal schedules. Medieval privacy often depended on whether the people around you respected a boundary that they could easily cross. A curtain could be pulled aside. A chest could be opened. A whispered conversation could be repeated. A servant could speak. A neighbor could notice. So the protection of the private self rested heavily on trust, fear, custom, and reputation. If others believed it was improper to intrude, then a fragile privacy could exist even in a crowded room. But that fragility made life tense. The same community that knew when to look away also knew how to punish someone by refusing to look away. Gossip was not merely idle talk. It was one of the main instruments through which a community interpreted itself. It could warn, entertain, discipline, exaggerate, protect, or destroy. In a village or town street, reputation could travel faster than proof. A person might be harmed not only by what they had done, but by what others believed they had done, and that belief could begin with a sound through a wall, a visitor at the wrong hour, a missing coin, a pregnancy, a quarrel, or a silence. For this reason, secrecy in the medieval world was not always a private pleasure. It could be a risk. To hide something was to create a space where suspicion might grow. A young couple meeting out of sight could become the subject of talk. A servant keeping something in a bundle could be suspected of theft. A merchant conducting business too quietly might invite doubt. A widow receiving visitors could be judged. A household that closed itself too tightly against the neighborhood might seem proud, troubled, or morally uncertain. Privacy had to be balanced carefully against the need to be seen as honest. This is why public witnesses mattered so much. If a marriage promise, a payment, a bargain, an apprenticeship agreement, or a reconciliation happened before others, it gained weight. Witnesses were not only legal conveniences. They were social anchors. They pulled an event out of ambiguity and placed it inside memory. In a world where documentation could be limited, expensive, or inaccessible to many people, the watching community helped stabilize truth. To be seen could be protective. To be unseen could be dangerous. Yet people still needed secrets. They needed them because human life has always contained desire, fear, shame, resentment, kindness, and plans that cannot easily be shared with everyone. A household might hide a little food in a bad season. A woman might keep back a coin. A servant might conceal a friendship. A young man might carry a private ambition. A family might soften the truth about illness, debt, or conflict. A lord might negotiate quietly before making a public decision. Even in a world of shared life, the hidden remained essential. Letters, where they existed, created a new kind of private space, though literacy was uneven and often mediated by others. For those who could read and write, or who had access to clerks, letters allowed words to travel beyond immediate witnesses. But a letter was not automatically private. It could be dictated, carried, sealed, opened, read aloud, copied, intercepted, or preserved. The seal could protect it, but it also displayed the importance of protecting it. A sealed letter was almost a miniature room, fragile, portable, and meaningful because it contained words not meant for every eye. Among elites, written correspondence could create networks of confidence across distance. Political plans, marriage negotiations, estate management, requests, complaints, and family concerns could move through letters. But every letter depended on messengers, scribes, and trust. Even secrecy required people. The private word traveled in public hands. That is a deeply medieval contradiction. The more important a secret was, the more carefully it had to be carried by others. For ordinary people, secrecy was often less written and more bodily. A glance, a pause, a gesture, a visit made at dusk, a conversation held near running water, a message passed through a child, a meeting at the edge of a field, a word exchanged at market while others were distracted. These were the small techniques of privacy. Medieval people did not need modern rooms to understand concealment. They used the landscape itself. A hedge, a churchyard corner, a lane, a barn, a field boundary, a crowd, a festival, a pilgrimage road, or the noise of work could all become temporary cover. Crowds are especially interesting because they could both expose and protect. In a small room, every movement might be noticed. In a market crowd, a person could vanish for a few moments into motion. In a festival, ordinary supervision loosened. During fairs, feast days, processions, and seasonal celebrations, people encountered strangers, music, food, drink, and movement outside the strict rhythm of daily labor. Such gatherings were public, but their very fullness created pockets of unpredictability. A private word could be hidden inside public noise. The church understood this tension well, because it dealt constantly with the hidden life of the soul. Medieval religious culture placed strong emphasis on inward intention, sin, confession, penance, and moral discipline. It taught that what was hidden from neighbors was not hidden from God. In one sense, this offered comfort. A person misunderstood by the community might still be known truly by divine judgment. In another sense, it meant there was no absolute privacy at all. Even the most secret thought belonged within a moral universe. This idea shaped behavior in subtle ways. A person might hide anger from a neighbor but confess it as a sin. A person might conceal desire but fear its spiritual weight. A person might perform public respectability while carrying inward guilt. The medieval lack of privacy was therefore not only social and architectural. It was also theological. The visible world might fail to see everything, but religious teaching insisted that the invisible world saw more than any neighbor could. That belief could deepen conscience, but it could also intensify anxiety. If privacy from other people was difficult, privacy from God was impossible. The heart itself became a watch chamber. The body could be crowded by family. The soul could be examined by faith. In the quietest moments of night, when a person finally seemed alone inside thought, the teachings of the church could still fill the darkness with judgment, hope, fear, and appeal for mercy. And yet religion also gave medieval people a language for interior life that should not be underestimated. Prayers, devotional images, saints' lives, confession, meditation, and liturgy offered ways to speak about grief, temptation, longing, and fear. A person who lacked a private room might still have private prayer. A person whose daily life was observed by neighbors might still cultivate an inward conversation no one else could fully hear. In this sense, the medieval interior self was not weak. It was often profoundly alive, precisely because outward life was so shared. Love, too, had to find its way through this exposed world. We should be careful not to romanticize medieval love as secret meetings in moonlit ruins, because most lives were more practical than that. Marriage involved families, property, labor, fertility, reputation, and law. Courtship could be watched. Promises could be disputed. Sexual behavior was morally regulated and socially consequential. But affection still existed. Desire still existed. Tenderness still existed. The difficulty was that these feelings often had to pass through public structures before they could become legitimate. A young couple might rarely have the kind of private dating life modern people imagine. They might meet in the presence of family, at work, at church, at market, during seasonal festivals, or in the rhythm of village life. Their interest could be observed before it was spoken. A lingering glance, repeated proximity, a rumor, a gift, a song, or a conversation could attract notice. Privacy in courtship was often dangerous because it could threaten reputation, especially for women. Yet, without some privacy, affection had little room to form. This tension made courtship a delicate negotiation between visibility and secrecy. Elite courtly culture added another layer. Literature of courtly love often played with secrecy, longing, restraint, service, and hidden emotion. It did not simply describe everyday life, but it reveals that medieval people were fascinated by the drama of feelings constrained by rank, marriage, honor, and public expectation. The beloved might be watched. The lover might suffer silently. Messages might be coded. Emotions might be performed through poetry, gifts, service, and gesture. Whether in literature or life, secrecy made love more intense because society made it difficult. Within marriage, privacy was equally complicated. Husband and wife might share a bed, a household, children, labor, and material survival, yet they often did so among other people. Servants, children, relatives, apprentices, lodgers, neighbors, and animals might all press near the married couple's life. Domestic arguments could be overheard. Affection could be noticed. Fertility, pregnancy, miscarriage, illness, and conflict could become public knowledge quickly. The couple's relationship was personal, but it was not sealed off from the household. For women, the exposure of married life could be especially consequential. A woman's reputation for chastity, household management, obedience, fertility, charity, Speech and sociability could shape how others treated her. Privacy might protect her dignity, but too much secrecy could create suspicion. She had to live visibly enough to be trusted, yet guarded enough to be respected. That balance was difficult, and it depended heavily on class, local custom, family power, and the goodwill of others. Men faced their own visible pressures. A husband was expected to govern his household, manage labor, maintain credit, represent honor, and appear capable before other men. If his household was disorderly, his debts known, his wife publicly unhappy, his servants disobedient, or his children badly behaved, his authority could be questioned. The household's lack of privacy meant that domestic life reflected outward on masculine reputation. A man could not easily separate public standing from private failure. Conflict therefore rarely stayed contained. A quarrel between spouses might be heard. A dispute between neighbors might spill into the lane. A disagreement over animals, boundary lines, rent, tools, wages, insults, or debts could move from private irritation to communal knowledge. Medieval courts, manorial records, and church courts often preserve traces of these disputes, though always imperfectly. What they show, again and again, is that ordinary life produced friction, and friction became public because people lived close together. But public conflict also offered public resolution. Neighbors could mediate, courts could hear complaints, priests could intervene, guilds could discipline members, lords' officials could judge local obligations, families could negotiate. In a private world, a person might suffer hidden harm for a long time. In a highly visible world, suffering might be noticed, though not always fairly or compassionately. Exposure could be dangerous, but it could also summon help. The same double edge appears in illness. A sick person in a crowded household had little bodily privacy. Symptoms, weakness, smell, fear, and dependency could be visible to many. Care took place through family, neighbors, religious charity, household servants, or local healers. This could be humiliating, especially when illness affected bodily control, appearance, or social function. But it also meant that illness was rarely an entirely isolated event. The household had to reorganize around the sick person. The community might bring aid, prayer, advice, or judgment. Medieval people did not experience disease through modern clinical privacy. They experienced it through the household bed, the shared room, the parish, the healer's visit, the priest's prayer, the neighbor's rumor, and the fear of contagion or divine meaning. A fever could become a family crisis. A wound could become a matter of testimony. A deformity, disability, or chronic condition could become part of one's public identity. The body was biography, and biography was visible. In times of epidemic, the relationship between privacy and community became even more strained. Fear could turn neighbors into watchers of symptoms. Houses could become known as dangerous. Funerals, bells, burials, absences, and sudden silences could announce what families might wish to hide. The desire to protect loved ones could conflict with the fear of being associated with sickness. Here, again, the lack of privacy was not merely uncomfortable. It could shape survival, blame, and memory. Death brought the most final exposure. The dying body was not usually hidden away behind institutional walls. It remained part of household and religious life. People gathered because death required witnesses, prayers, preparation, inheritance arrangements, confession, reconciliation, and ritual. A good death, in many medieval Christian understandings, was not a private vanishing. It was a spiritually ordered event, ideally prepared, witnessed, and surrounded by the right words and rites. To die alone could be frightening not only emotionally, but spiritually. The corpse, too, moved through public care. Washing, wrapping, carrying, Watching, mourning, burial, and commemoration involved others. Grief entered the street, the church, and the memory of the parish. This public quality could honor the dead, but it also meant that death revealed the household. Its resources, its kinship ties, its debts, its piety, its standing. Even the final passage from life to memory was not fully private. And still, medieval people found tenderness inside this. A watched death could be a supported death. A crowded birth could be a protected birth. A public marriage could be a recognized marriage. A known household could be a helped household. The story cannot be reduced to misery. The discomfort of exposure existed beside the comfort of belonging. That is what makes the medieval world so difficult and so human. Privacy was limited, but isolation was also limited. The same closeness that trapped people could hold them. For children, this meant growing up in a world where adults were constantly observable. They learned not from abstract instruction alone, but from immersion. They saw labor before they understood it. They heard disputes before they could interpret them. They watched prayer, hunger, illness, craft, authority, marriage, and old age at close range. Childhood had fewer protected rooms, but more direct contact with the machinery of adult life. This could be harsh, but it also made the household a school of survival. A child might sleep near parents, siblings, servants, or animals. They might learn the sounds of the house at night and the signals of mood in the morning. They might carry messages through the village, fetch water, watch younger children, help with animals, gather fuel, or assist in small tasks. Through these duties, they became part of the community's network of observation. Children saw what adults did not always mean them to see, and they carried knowledge between spaces. In a low-privacy world, children were never as separate from adult affairs as many modern adults might expect. Adolescence sharpened the problem. A growing body attracted new kinds of attention. Work expectations increased. Marriage prospects began to matter. Reputation became more fragile. A young person needed room to become an adult, but the community often watched that process closely. Mistakes could follow them. Promises could be remembered. Improper behavior could damage future arrangements. Youthful privacy was limited precisely when the desire for it may have been strongest. This is why festivals, seasonal gatherings, and pilgrimages could feel so important. They altered the ordinary arrangement of eyes. A pilgrimage could remove someone temporarily from the village's tight circle and place them among strangers, companions, shrines, roads, and stories. It was religious, but also social and spatial. A fair could bring unfamiliar faces and goods. A feast day could soften labor rhythms. These moments did not create modern freedom, but they loosened daily surveillance. They allowed people to be seen differently. The road, however, always carried risk. Away from the known community, a person lost the protection of reputation. At home, people might know your parents, your trade, your debts, your habits, your standing. On the road, you could be misread, cheated, accused, robbed, or ignored. Anonymity was not always liberation. Sometimes it was danger. Medieval people lived between two fears, being too closely known and not being known at all. This tension shaped hospitality. To receive a traveler was to admit a stranger into a space of limited privacy. Inns, monasteries, hospitals, and households had to manage the stranger's presence. Who was this person? What did they carry? Were they honest, sick, dangerous, poor, holy, useful? A guest had rights in some moral traditions, but also raised suspicion. Hospitality opened the door, and every door opened the household to risk. Within inns, privacy was especially thin. Travelers might share beds or chambers with people they had only just met. Goods had to be guarded. Stories could be invented. Names could be false. A person's status had to be read from clothing, speech, companions, animals, letters, or money. The inn made strangers temporarily intimate. It compressed social uncertainty into shared rooms, shared meals, and shared sleep. Military life did the same in harsher form. Soldiers, camp followers, servants, craftsmen, and animals gathered in camps where personal privacy could be almost non-existent. Bodies slept near bodies. Armor, weapons, wounds, hunger, fear, discipline, and boredom were shared under pressure. The individual's body belonged to a larger force. Even courage and fear became observable. A person could not easily hide trembling hands, exhaustion, sickness, or hesitation from those beside him. For monks and nuns, by contrast, the loss of privacy was deliberate and rule-bound. Communal sleeping, shared prayer, regulated silence, common meals, confession, obedience, and oversight were meant to shape the soul. In many religious communities, the individual will was not supposed to reign freely. The discipline of being seen and corrected could be understood as a path toward humility. This does not mean every monk or nun found it easy. It means that in some medieval settings, the reduction of personal privacy was not a failure of comfort, but a spiritual design. That design had its own tensions. A person might enter a monastery seeking withdrawal from the world, only to find another kind of crowded life inside the cloister. Silence did not remove observation. Obedience did not erase personality. Dormitories, refectories, chapter meetings, confession, work assignments, and liturgical schedules created a life where the self was constantly shaped by the community. The monastery's walls protected it from the outside, but inside those walls, privacy was carefully managed and often intentionally limited. The more we move through these different worlds, household, village, town, in castle, monastery, road, camp, the more we see that medieval privacy was never one thing. It changed with place and rank. It changed with gender and age. It changed with day and night. It changed with whether a person was known, unknown, powerful, dependent, sick, young, married, vowed, traveling, serving, or ruling. To ask what it was like to live without real privacy is really to ask how people lived when the self was almost always entangled with others. And this entanglement shaped the built world itself. People did not only live in crowded spaces because they had no other choice. Over time, they began to mark degrees of access more carefully. They built inner chambers beyond outer halls. They used screens, galleries, stairways, gates, courtyards, walls, curtains, locks, and service passages. They placed certain activities deeper inside the house and others nearer the threshold. Architecture began to express not only shelter and status, but the management of visibility. That movement was slow, uneven, and incomplete, but it matters because it shows that privacy was becoming more spatial. A person of rank could be approached in stages. A visitor might enter the yard, then the hall, but not the chamber. A servant might reach the kitchen, but not the treasury. A clerk might enter a counting space, but not a bedchamber. A guest might be honored by being invited farther inward. The house became a map of trust. And once a house becomes a map of trust, every door begins to speak. Who may pass? Who must wait? Who knocks? Who enters without knocking? Who holds the key? Who sleeps near the threshold? Who is hidden in the inner room? Who is displayed in the hall? These questions would gradually become more important as medieval households grew more complex, and as the desire for controlled access became one of the quiet forces reshaping domestic life. The next step is to follow that movement inward, through the thresholds and guarded rooms where medieval people began to separate the seen parts of life from the parts they wanted, however imperfectly, to keep behind the door. To follow that movement inward, we have to begin at the threshold because the medieval doorway was more than a gap in a wall. It was the place where the household decided how much of itself to reveal. A neighbor might stand near it and call inside. A customer might be received at it. A beggar might wait before it. A servant might pass through it without hesitation. A stranger might be stopped there until someone judged his purpose. The threshold marked a boundary, but not an absolute one. It was a point of negotiation between the public world of the street, lane, yard, or village path, and the more controlled world within. In poorer homes, this boundary could be thin. Sound escaped easily. Smells drifted out. Children ran through. Animals might move close to the entrance. Work might spill into the yard or street. If the doorway was open for light, air, trade, or labor, then the interior could not be fully hidden. The house breathed with the community around it. A passerby might glimpse the hearth, the hanging tools, the stored baskets, the bedding pushed aside, the tired face of someone working in dim light. The household was not trying to display everything, but life itself was difficult to conceal. In wealthier houses, the boundary could be managed with greater care. Gates, yards, screens, doors, halls, stairways, and servants created layers. A visitor might not pass directly from the outside world into the deepest domestic spaces. They might first enter a courtyard, then a hall, then perhaps be admitted farther, depending on rank, trust, and purpose. In this layered arrangement, privacy became a journey. The deeper one was allowed to go, the more honored, trusted, or useful one became. This is one of the quiet origins of a more private domestic life. Not the sudden invention of personal space, but the gradual refinement of access. The medieval house began to say, in stone, timber, cloth, and custom, that not every person should see every part of life. The hall could remain public. The chamber could be selective. The inner room could be guarded. The chest could be locked. The bed could be curtained. The body could be dressed with help, but screened from the crowd. The household did not become private all at once. It became divided. Yet division did not always mean comfort. A door could protect a lord's counsel, but it could also exclude servants from warmth. A chamber could shelter a lady's reputation, but it could also place her under closer supervision. A locked room could preserve treasure, but it could also remind everyone else that they possessed nothing worth locking away. Privacy was never neutral. It revealed hierarchy. The right to withdraw belonged most securely to those who already had power. For ordinary people, the movement inward was slower and more limited. A cottage might remain crowded. A rented urban room might hold too many bodies. A servant might sleep where work ended. An apprentice might find no space that belonged to him alone. A widow, a lodger, a migrant worker, or a poor family in a town could experience the medieval world not as a romantic network of community, but as a constant pressure of other people's needs. The larger architectural story of privacy did not reach everyone equally. Still, even modest households could create small zones of discretion. A cloth hung across a corner, a chest placed near a wall, a loft used for sleeping, a yard used for a private word, a visit timed when others were away, a prayer whispered before dawn. A person might not possess a room, but they could possess a habit. They could know when the house was quietest, which neighbor was discreet, which path was least watched, which task offered a few minutes of distance, which family member could be trusted with a secret. This is why medieval privacy should not be imagined only through architecture. It lived in timing. It lived in manners. It lived in the ability to control a face while others watched. It lived in the decision not to repeat a rumor, not to open a chest, not to enter without permission, not to look too closely at someone's poverty or grief. A society with little private space had to develop other ways to soften exposure. Those ways did not always work, but they mattered. As the later Middle Ages moved toward the early modern world, a Especially among elites and prosperous townspeople, the interior of the house gradually became more specialized. More rooms could mean more separation between cooking, sleeping, working, receiving, storing, and withdrawing. The Great Hall did not vanish overnight, but its dominance began to weaken in some settings. Smaller rooms, more controlled chambers, studies, closets, and withdrawing spaces would eventually help create a world in which the private self could be imagined more fully inside architecture. But we should be careful with that word, progress. More privacy did not simply mean a kinder world. It could bring comfort, dignity, reflection, and emotional shelter. It could also bring loneliness, secrecy, social distance, and sharper class divisions. The medieval household was crowded, intrusive, and often exhausting, but it also made isolation difficult. People were seen when they were hungry, sick, grieving, aging, struggling, or failing. That visibility could wound them, but it could also summon help. A more private world would protect many things, but it would hide many things too. The medieval world reminds us that privacy and community are not simple opposites. They are always in conversation. Too little privacy can crush the self. Too much isolation can leave the self unsupported. Medieval people often lived too far toward exposure, by modern standards, but they also understood forms of belonging that modern life sometimes weakens. The neighbor who knew too much might also be the neighbor who came when the roof failed, when childbirth turned dangerous, when hunger arrived, when a debt needed witness, when grief needed company, or when death entered the room. That does not make the discomfort disappear. It only makes it more human. To live without real privacy in the Middle Ages was to live with the body, the household, and the community constantly overlapping. It meant waking before others had stopped sleeping. It meant dressing near the same fire that cooked the meal. It meant eating where rank could be seen. It meant working where skill and fatigue were visible. It meant managing bodily needs with limited seclusion. It meant loving, arguing, praying, suffering, and aging within hearing distance of other lives. It meant that dignity had to be practiced, not assumed. A person's sense of self depended partly on the restraint of others. A woman's reputation could rest on what neighbors said or did not say. A man's authority could be measured by the order of his household. A servant's survival could depend on discretion. A child's future could be shaped by memories the community kept. A lord's power could be displayed by how far he could withdraw from the hall, and a peasant's vulnerability could be measured by how little there was to withdraw into. And yet, medieval people were not incomplete versions of ourselves. They were not simply waiting for modern bedrooms, bathrooms, locks, curtains, and private schedules to make them fully human. They had interior lives as deep and complicated as ours. They had embarrassment, tenderness, ambition, resentment, faith, fear, humor, patience, and longing. They had secrets. They had strategies. They had moments of quiet, even when quiet was hard to find. They knew what it meant to be watched, and they knew what it meant to hide something in the heart. Perhaps the greatest difference is that medieval people lived in a world where the self was rarely imagined apart from its obligations. A person belonged to a household, a parish, a lordship, a guild, a family, a marriage, a craft, a village, a town, a religious order, or a chain of service. To be seen by others was not an occasional interruption. It was part of being real in the social world. Reputation was not a surface decoration. It was a form of identity, credit, protection, and danger. That is why a lack of privacy shaped nearly everything. It shaped architecture because rooms had to manage access. It shaped religion because conscience was both inward and watched by God. It shaped law because truth depended on witnesses. It shaped love because desire had to pass through reputation. It shaped work because labor was visible. It shaped class because the rich could withdraw more easily than the poor. It shaped gender because modesty and honor were guarded unequally. It shaped childhood because growing up meant growing up in view. By the end of the medieval period, the desire for more controlled spaces had not erased communal life, but it had begun to leave clearer marks. The chamber, the solar, the curtained bed, the locked chest, the private letter, the guarded threshold, the servant at the door, the study, the closet, the inward room, each was part of a long, uneven transformation. The modern private life did not arrive suddenly. It emerged slowly from crowded halls, shared beds, public meals, watched streets, and the quiet human wish to keep at least something unseen. And maybe that is the most revealing part of all. Privacy was not absent because medieval people lacked inner lives. It was scarce because their world was built around shared survival. They gathered for warmth because fuel was precious. They slept near others because space was limited. They worked where they lived because labor and household were intertwined. They relied on witnesses because trust needed memory. They accepted intrusion because community could be protection. They endured exposure because isolation could be even more dangerous. So when we imagine a medieval room at night, with the fire reduced to embers, bodies lying close in the dimness, tools near the wall, smoke caught in the roof, a child stirring, an animal shifting, and someone awake with thoughts no one else can hear, we are looking at more than discomfort. We are looking at a different arrangement of human life. A world where privacy existed in fragments. A world where dignity survived through custom. A world where the self had to make room for others because the room itself was never truly one's own. What detail feels hardest to imagine living with today? The shared sleeping, the lack of bodily privacy, the constant gossip, or the simple fact that almost no part of the day belonged entirely to you? And if this kind of calm, thoughtful history helps you settle into the past more deeply, you're welcome to come back for more long-form stories like this. The medieval world still has many quiet corners left to explore, even if the people who lived inside it rarely had a quiet corner of their own.